Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here. And of course, welcome to everybody watching on YouTube to the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel. It is a little strange that I'm introducing a video for Cameron's channel, but unfortunately he is sat right behind you and will not be on camera this time. But we are here in Houston, Texas for the Capturing Christianity Exchange, which is bringing together a Catholic, Protestant, an atheist, and an agnostic to talk about the philosophy of religion and discussion. And right now, I'm joined by the wonderful Trent Horn, who I'm going to allow to tell you a bit about himself, and then also explain briefly why he is a Christian, and maybe if we're lucky, specifically a Catholic. I'll take some time then to explain why I am not, and then the idea is we're just going to have a bit of an interaction, and hopefully we'll be able to make some progress. But then, most excitingly, we're going to open up the floor to any questions that you might have for any of us on anything remotely related to anything that we're saying, and make sure we've got plenty of time to engage with you. So I'll hand it over to Trent. But yeah, thanks for being here, and I hope this is worth everyone's time.
All righty. Right, so I'm very grateful to be here. I'm thankful that Cameron put this event on, and it's super fun to now finally meet Alex in person, actually. The first thing that shocks me is that, especially for those of you watching from home, he's tall. He's like 6'1". It's like when you see people, and Joe is tall too, by the way. It's like whenever you watch somebody on your phone and you're just at home watching YouTube on your phone, I guess you get this feeling they're like 4 feet tall because you're holding them in your hand and you're watching them on your phone. And then when you meet them in person, it's a bit disarming. It's like when you take your kids to Disneyland and then they've watched Mickey Mouse on TV and he's only 5 inches tall on a TV. And then they get to the park, they're like, oh, you're so much bigger than on television or on the computer. But no, it's been great. And Alex and I have already been chatting for a while. We've been talking about problem of evil, ethics, a lot of great things. So yeah, so my name is, for those of you who don't know, my name is Trent Horn. I'm a staff apologist at Catholic Answers. And yeah, I do podcasts and YouTube videos. And we're going to talk about I'm going to say why I'm Christian. Why I'm Catholic is another story. I talked with Cameron about that yesterday. But why? So I'll explain why I'm Christian. Alex will give a little bit why he's an atheist, and we can have a nice back and forth. And I guess I would say I'm Christian because it is an amazing story that fills in all of reality for me. I was really looking forward to this engagement, especially the way the prompt is. Like, the prompt wasn't necessarily why you should be Christian or why you should not be Christian. It's kind of like both of us sharing why we are and are not. So I can make this a little bit more, testimonial almost. But for me, I'm not Christian because of warm, fuzzy feelings. I've never been somebody who got, I'm always jealous of Christians who go and pray and they get to put their hands up, and it's a lot of warm fuzzies. Like, I wish I could have that. But a lot of things fell into place for me to make sense of the world in that respect. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant said this once, and it resonated with me. Kant said, "There are two things that continue to fill me with wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within." And for me, those two aspects of reality really point towards theism, towards a God who is necessary, infinite, and has created the world, looking around and seeing that I wonder, why do things exist? Why is there anything at all? A thing either has no explanation, it's explained by something else, or it explains its own existence. And I really like science a bunch. When I was a kid, I was in the Young Astronomers Club. I don't think you can get science can't go really far if no explanation is a workable answer for a lot of questions. And I don't see anything in the universe that cries out that it can explain itself like other things that can explain itself. At the very least, we see things around us that need explanation. I mean, they could be explained by other things. But then in seeing things being explained by other things, this gets to other kinds of cosmological arguments for God. Maybe why past events, how do they explain each other? Do they just go on forever? Or the process of change, how something can be potentially one thing, it's actually another. In order to change, it has to be actualized by something else. Could there just be an infinite chain of actualizers? And when I look at all these arguments about the starry heavens, I either get to no explanation is insufficient. Infinity is just a really bad thing to bring into the world. I don't think it works. I like the work of people like Rob Koons and Alex Proust showing that causal chains are finite. And seeing that when you introduce infinity into the real world to try to explain things, or at least infinite series, infinite connections, I think it creates more problems than you want to solve. So for me, having a cause that is just pure actuality, necessary, unchanging, eternal, powerful, you might say, well, Trent, how do you get to all the other divine attributes? How do you get God out of all of that? To me, though, if this ultimate cause of reality is not material, that's a very weird thing to have on atheism, to have a causal power that is not composed of matter. I think that points very strongly into a divine direction into it. And so that would be the other end, would be morality, kind of bringing it down to earth a little bit. And there's a lot of people who make different moral arguments for God and different things that point out to them. And I believe you can be a good person without knowledge of God. There are good atheists. They're good at atheism and they pursue the moral life well. Alex is one of them. He's been challenging me on factory farming, and veganism. So very soon I will either be a totally full-on vegan or I will be an unapologetic defender of factory farming. So I'm going to get off the fence one way or the other soon. But the idea, and I think that's good that he has that conviction. I love that. I hate when people are apathetic about morality. But that conviction raises more questions for me about the moral universe, the existence of moral laws. The universe, it ought to be a certain way. That kind of implies a kind of design for me. In fact, one argument I'm kind of working on now, Alex and I were chatting about this, I kind of call it like a pro-life argument for the existence of God, related to a very particular aspect of morality, human dignity. Because I was actually involved in pro-life apologetics before doing Christian apologetics. And I would try to figure out, well, why is it that there's intrinsic dignity and a right to life for me and Alex and a newborn baby and a fetus and an embryo, but not for like a rat, a cow, or a pig? There's no, biological function that gives us our right to life. It seems like our dignity is tied to our species. But why is that? That seems so arbitrary. Well, what if our species was, and some people will tell me, well, Trent, your pro-life view, you're just imposing this religious view that human beings remain in the image of God. And I always thought that was a weakness for the pro-life view. But now I think it's actually a strength for Christian theism. No, I think a lot of people agree that humans are exceptional. The human species is different than other species. We have intrinsic dignity. And I think only a theistic explanation can account for that. So for me, putting all of that together shows that I would say it would show that God exists, all good, infinite, all powerful, all knowing. And then has this God revealed himself? And to me, the resurrection of Jesus Christ best explains many of the facts related to around the starting of Christianity. In fact, one work that I want to start soon for a book is I want to compare different miracle accounts. Because some people say, well, if you believe in Jesus, why don't you believe in other miracles, non-Christian miracles? And I look at other non-Christian miracles, and I don't think they have as good evidence as the resurrection. Antony Flew was at one time a famous deist, and famous atheist. And even when he was an atheist, he said the evidence of the resurrection was different than other alleged miracles in the ancient world. And I actually went and looked in the writings of atheists to say, okay, well, what are the alternatives? Like Christians believe the resurrection, and they won't believe this other miracle, so they're arbitrary. And I read the writings of atheists. Well, what other miracles do they not believe? One of the most common ones were, well, Christians believe in the resurrection, but they don't believe in Marian apparitions. Well, some Christians do. So I'm Catholic, and actually that's not problematic for my worldview. So I guess that's a lot, and I didn't want to. I made a thick cheesecake of trying to condense everything for why there's so much. But for me, God, the world's a puzzle. You can't. Causal chains are finite. There's intrinsic human dignity. There's change in actuality. There's the Christian movement, unique to all other religions. It's like this big puzzle. There's just one piece missing to tie it all together. And it's that God created the universe and is behind this. And it all fits, and I don't see a comparably good reason to think that it doesn't make sense. So that's why I'm Christian. And Alex, why are you an atheist then?
Well, beautifully put, as always, Trent. Although there are more than two things that amaze me when I look around the world, or capture my imagination, let's say. Of course, the stars at night are incredible. The moral feeling that every person intuitively has, except maybe a few eccentric examples of human beings who don't appear to have that within them. These are amazing, but what also captivates me in the nature of our human experience is the depth of suffering to which we're all capable of sinking. I think that suffering in many ways defines the human experience, and certainly the experience of non-humans, such that I know people who will go their entire life saying that they've never really experienced any real pleasure. Their whole life has been a misery. But you'll never find a person who says that their entire life they haven't had any real pain and suffering. This is something that equally needs to be accounted for. Now, to me, I said this in a conversation that I had with Trent and the others yesterday. The problem of evil, as it's famously formulated against the existence of a good God, is usually thought of as a response to religion, as a response to the existence of a God. You have this construct, you have this idea of an afterlife and of ethics and of a perfectly good being, and then you look around you at the immeasurable levels of suffering that we experience, the nihilism, the pointlessness, the pain, and we say this causes a problem, it's a response to it. But I think this is exactly the wrong way around. I think that the suffering came first, the nihilism came first, and that religion itself is a response to this. And so if you're wondering why it is that, of course, when you look at the nature of our human experience, why is it that we have this wonderful thing that seems to just explain it all away and give us a kind of comfort that we so desperately need? Well, maybe that's because it was how it was designed. The greatest accounts of nihilism and pain and suffering and of reaching out to God and finding no answer can be found in religious scripture. You can find in the book of Job the experience of a man who is suffering and doesn't know why. You can find in Ecclesiastes the lambastation at the meaninglessness of existence, the toiling and the toiling to no end, the fact that eventually all of our achievements will be given to somebody who is unworthy of them when we die and have to pass everything we have on to another person. And the book of Ecclesiastes ends with saying, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That is, you have pages and pages and pages of nihilistic outcry. Somebody saying they just cannot understand why everything is so meaningless. They cannot live a meaningful life. They cannot find pleasure and joy in anything. And the conclusion of this is fear God and follow his commandments. It's kind of tacked on at the end there. The author of Ecclesiastes, the person who wrote it, is reporting the words of somebody else, Kohelet, who is the one who's the nihilist. And at the very end of this, the author adds on their own addendum where they say, therefore, fear God and keep his commandments. And what does this say to us? It says to us that maybe this is just a way to escape the suffering. Maybe we just all recognize that we've been dropped into this completely ununderstandable circus of pain and torment and confusion, and we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea where we got here, and it's terrifying. It's scary. And so we come up with a way to try to console ourselves in this situation. Now, if we look at how suffering is embedded into not just the human experience, as I say, but also the non-human experience, then we can ask a simple question. What would we expect to see if Christianity were true? What would we expect to see? How would we expect life to have evolved? What would we expect people's interactions to be like? And if we assumed atheism, again, if we assumed, as I said earlier, that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms who just find themselves in a situation where they need to compete for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? We find a system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, which is not, it doesn't just entail, but is based upon suffering, and death. Survival of the fittest entails the death and destruction and suffering of the unfit. 99% plus of all the species who've ever existed on this planet have been brutally wiped from existence. Even within the history of our own species, we've got all kinds of sufferings involved in its development throughout its history. Now, this kind of stuff is embedded into the very machinery by which God chose to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained by Christianity. Of course, you could say that maybe this is all part of some grand plan. Maybe the suffering is compensated for in the afterlife. Maybe animals do go to heaven after all, and it just kind of makes up for all the suffering that they're forced to undergo. I'm not going to say this is impossible, but I'm going to ask you what you think is more plausibly the case if we assume either hypothesis. What would you expect to see? I don't think we'd expect to see anything like this if we assumed that there was a benevolent invigilator. But as I say, if we assume atheism, not only do we explain what we see in the world, but we also come to expect it. I think it's a much better account. This is the problem of evil. Now, there's another argument, or another consideration, which is sometimes thought of as a subset of the problem of evil, and that's the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, then why is he so hidden from so many of us, so much of the time, even from those who so desperately seek his attention? Of course, there are people who are what J.L. Schellenberg has called resistant non-believers. They don't believe in God, probably through something of their own fault. Maybe they're resisting in some sense. Maybe they're blinding themselves to the evidence. Maybe they're really unwilling to approach the question honestly. Maybe they don't want it to be true and wouldn't accept it even if it were true. Lots of people like this do exist, of course. But as long as there is one example of somebody who honestly seeks God, wants to enter into a relationship with God, and has refused it, there's a problem here. How can this be explained? Schellenberg formalizes the problem as saying, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur, therefore it would follow that there is no God. Now, maybe one of the controversial premises there is that if there exists a loving God, non-resistant non-belief would not occur. But in order to deny that premise, we have to accept that God would be willing to allow somebody to desperately search for him, and to do so honestly and openly and non-resistantly, and just hide his face from them. And this is something that I'm often told will be something, there'll be a problem with what I'm doing. When I speak to a Christian and I say, look, I'm just not convinced of this. I'm sorry, I've tried, I've looked at the arguments, I've been to church, I've prayed, I got a degree in theology, I moved in with Christian housemates and lived with them for a year to see if maybe in the minutiae of daily life I can begin to see the truth and beauty of Christianity, and I have experienced precisely nothing in response. Nothing, not once. And so sometimes I'm told that, well, look, are you really searching openly? If you were to really approach the questions, if you dig a bit deeper, God will finally reveal himself for you. Maybe he's got a big plan for you. Maybe there's a reason why he's keeping you in the dark right now. Feels like I'm kind of being used if that's the case. It's like lucky for those who don't have to go through that experience, I guess. But what am I doing wrong? What is it that I could be doing wrong, given the history of my experience that I've just described to you? I would ask Trent, for example, if you woke up tomorrow and found yourself in my shoes, that is, you just suddenly were overwhelmed with this conviction that God doesn't actually exist, and that all of our moral intuitions are best explained as an offshoot of natural selection. Isn't it surprising that so many of the moral rules that we intuitively feel are those which seem to be beneficial to the survival of a society or a species? It seems quite strange. If you just awoke with this conviction, what would you do? What could you do? It's like, yeah, you could go to church, but you just don't feel it. You could listen to the arguments again, but somehow they just ring hollow. It's not like you get to choose what you're convinced of after all. You hear an argument, if you're not convinced of it, you're just not convinced. You don't get to choose to become convinced by it. You go through all these motions, and yet you find yourself still, as Shakespeare had it, troubling deaf heaven with your bootless cries. What do you do? And what is it that I could possibly be doing wrong? Because the other thing, of course, you can say is that, yes, non-resistant non-belief, it does occur. In other words, like this response that people take and where they say that I'm actually resisting in some sense, I'm doing something wrong, they're essentially denying the premise that non-resistant non-belief does occur. So maybe non-resistant non-belief does occur, but then we have to explain why it is that God hides his face from so many people. I don't know that you have responses to this, but I think that they fail. These are the two main reasons, of course. Now, there are also responses that I have to the arguments that are put forward by Christians. This is kind of a different level of argumentation for an atheist, because I can put a case forward saying the problem of evil and divine hiddenness make me suspicious of the God hypothesis. But equally, the things that Trent says I'm suspicious of too, particularly the claims that pertain specifically to Christianity. I can't remember exactly what it is you said about Christianity that makes it seem so true to you as opposed to other theistic religions, but perhaps that's something we can get into presently. But that's more or less at least a starting point for the approach that I'm taking to this conversation. I will also say that part of my non-resistant non-belief has been a bit of a shift. If you look at some of the material that I made when I was a teenager, which unfortunately enough is available online, you can see that I take an approach that religion is bad, and this is an approach that people often take. It's like you kind of join a team. If you become convinced that God doesn't exist or unconvinced that God exists, you join this team of people and you kind of feel compelled to say that it must be a bad thing as well. But these are mutually exclusive. I think that saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. Yeah, sure, okay, politics is bad, but it's not as simple as that, because everybody agrees that politics is bad. It causes so many wars, it tears families apart, this kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that you don't think that one political view is correct or appropriate. You're still going to vote at a ballot booth, unless, of course, you're like an anarchist or something, which these people do exist. And so, yes, of course, I think that certain doctrines and certain religions are bad, and I wouldn't want them to be true, but I think that just the basic idea that there is a perfect being who does actually care about you and will make up for your suffering, I think this is something that any rational person should desire. So here I am, I desire it, I'm open to it being true, I'm here to engage with the arguments. What is it that I'm doing wrong? Trent might say, here are some arguments, here are some considerations, so why are you not a Christian? Why don't you believe in God? Good point. Why not? Why is it that if presented with the same evidence, you are just made of a psychological constitution such that it convinces you, and I am not? Maybe God has some reason to be toying with me, but not with you. In which case, lucky you, I guess. I just don't see what I could be doing wrong here. That's the in and out of it, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
All right. Well, now I guess we can get into discussing back and forth then, how we feel.
Sure.
All righty. Where to start? Well, do you think it's possible that the reason I believe in God, even though, well, you would say it's highly probable God does not exist, would be your view?
Highly probable is putting it a bit
probable,
strongly.
more than 51%.
I would say I kind of lean towards it. I'm always suspicious of putting numbers on credence to belief. So I think, what does it mean to kind of believe something 20%? Like, I don't really know what this means, but I certainly lean more towards strong A atheism. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't be able to put a number on it.
So what I would say is, if you're asking me, what do I think you've done wrong? It'd probably be the same answer you would give me as to why I have a misplaced confidence God does exist. I have made, there's different reasons why people believe or don't believe. And I think it's possible smart people can fail to believe certain things because they make certain cognitive errors. It's not necessarily a moral error, but we find certain intuitions more plausible than others. We make different inferences. We have different values of different kinds of evidences that are presented. And we look at the world in different ways. So, for example, when you look out into nature and you see the evil, the suffering, nature red in tooth and claw, human suffering, I see that, but I also see other strange things. I see a moral obligation to help people, and not just people, but a moral obligation to help non-humans not suffer, as if I have this command to do that. Though I do see that the humans who suffer have a dignity and a value that the animals do not. And I see hope and virtues. I see other things in there that make me look at the picture in a different way, if that makes sense.
But of course, it's different, because from an atheistic paradigm, I wouldn't expect that everybody who honestly seeks the truth will find it. Like, on an atheistic paradigm, people can very easily seek for the truth and just get it wrong. Mm-hmm. There's no guiding principle here. There's nobody who is there to catch you where you go wrong. On Christianity, if somebody goes honestly wrong, you'd expect them to be guided to the truth, because there's a God who wants to come to know this person, and they've gone wrong through no fault of their own. This is why Schellenberg shifts from, he used to talk about, originally the argument was formulated in terms of reasonable and non-reasonable disbelief. He swapped to saying resistant and non-resistant unbelief, because these are two different things. You can reasonably believe a falsehood, and on atheism, you can non-resistantly believe falsehoods. There's no problem with this. Of course, you can be open to something being true and just not be convinced of it. There's no problem with this. But if you believe that there's somebody overseeing this who will look at people who are honestly seeking and they go wrong, and just somehow allows them to go wrong, because it would be so easy to fix. Most people who come to Christianity do not do so because they've read a syllogism in a book somewhere. If you ask a friend who's a Christian what their conversion story is, if they weren't a Christian all their life, it's incredibly rare that you find somebody saying that they read a particular argument and they just suddenly drop to their knees. Rather, it's usually something more experiential. Maybe the arguments that they're reading inform something that they've experienced, or maybe they have an experience that is informed by things that they've read, sure, but it's the experience, it's that feeling that actually causes somebody to convert. So for somebody who's non-resistantly non-believing, all it would take is a sign. All it would take is an experience that this person can interpret as a religious experience. And that's all I'm looking for here. And so in other words, you say, well, I'm saying to you, isn't there a problem that people non-resistantly don't believe in Christianity? And you're saying, well, it's the same as me, non-resistantly not believing in atheism.
Right.
Two things.
Because you believe there's no God of atheism that could set me straight, but there is a God in Christianity that could set people straight.
Not only that, but there's another asymmetry, which is that I'm an atheist, you're a Christian. Mm. I want to be a Christian. Mm. You don't want to be an atheist, presumably.
I want the truth. And at this point in my life, I'm highly convinced atheism is not that thing. So you're right. It's not something I'm trying to actively ascertain. But I think then, so the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene? I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset really of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. Animal pain is bad. Not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen, like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue. Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it. Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, here's this circle. He could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff? And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others. For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively, in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom. And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign. I'm kind of skeptical that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real. So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it, is to make it simple, is that, look, we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things. Who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist. And the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in a situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in. But I actually want to imagine that you see a parent who, and maybe you don't know anything about dentistry, maybe you're from an isolated tribe or something, and you see a parent kind of taking these sharp objects and digging into a child's mouth, and you think, oh, this looks pretty bad. Someone explains to you about dentistry, and you think, okay, right, so there's good reason for the parent to be inflicting this kind of suffering. Now, if we consider the kinds of suffering that we see across the natural world, we're not just talking about these kinds of cases of obvious benefit or menial suffering. We're talking about deep, intense, unimaginable suffering. So now imagine that you were walking along a road and you saw a parent just mercilessly beating up a child, just ripping the child limb from limb, just punching it, like contorting it out of shape. And you said, this is terrible, this is disgusting, and we need to intervene. And I said to you, well, look, hold on a second. You accepted that a parent might have good reason to inflict suffering on their child if there's good justifiable reason. And if you're willing to accept it for these kinds of suffering, why wouldn't you accept it for this kind of suffering? It's at least plausible they have good reason. Maybe there is some kind of reason that we are just incapable of understanding about their relationship, where this is something that needs to be done and is morally justifiable. But I don't think it just follows from the fact that we can imagine some circumstances in which the infliction of suffering would be permitted by a good God, that we should just hypothesize that even if we see a great deal of apparently meaningless suffering, we should just conclude on the basis of that yeah, he probably has good reason for that too. I just don't think that follows.
Well, I think my reply to that would be, if I saw a parent engage in terrible abuse of a child, I have background knowledge to know what human parents are and are not capable of to contribute to the well-being of a child. And so a parent who is dismembering or eviscerating a child, I have sufficient background knowledge, given what human parents are, to know they cannot be contributing to the child's well-being. And also comparing it to a reference class, unfortunately well populated by parents who are abusive towards their children, and that this parent belongs to that reference class. But with God, however, if God exists, then I know that he is not limited in power or knowledge to bring about greater goods. He's not limited like a human parent in that regard. And then also, so the argument that you make, it is subject to a modus tollens, to a reversal. It's essentially saying, if gratuitous evils exist, God does not exist. Gratuitous evils exist, therefore God does not exist. But if God does exist, it just turns out the evils are only apparently gratuitous. And so that will come down to our position we're in. But I also think that God's ability, when we look at the world also, when we talk, I think this is also important to bring up when we talk about the world, right? Like when you look at the world, when I look at the world, what do we expect? The world, like right now, the world, it's like it's like a slice of what we're looking at. Like the world is this 4-dimensional block. Imagine like the world is not just like right now. It's like the whole thing. And so under the Christian view, it's like there's a beginning of it. There's a trial period. The Catechism talks about it journeying to perfection. And then there is an unending, and this end of the block has no end. And it's reached perfection. So then we've discussed this before, and I apologize if it feels like we're going to tread ground we've already tread, but we have new people listening, which is good. One could ask the question, is it better, if God exists, would it be the case he would only create a world we call perfect? Or would he create a world that journeys to perfection? And I would say a world that journeys to perfection would actually be somewhat expected because it has more goods in it. It has the goods of perfection, and then the other goods that lead up to that, like goods you can only have that are associated with evils, like compassion, courage, forgiveness, things like that. So that's one element there. And then to share an analogy I shared with you before in our conversation on evil, I understand being concerned about evil, but it'd be like 2 orphans saying, we're in this terrible orphanage, our parents don't love us, or, why would they do this? And one orphan says, you're right, we have no parents. Oh, okay, well, clearly we have parents. How else would we couldn't exist without them? So the question is, what is their nature? Oh, so back to the world thing, though, it's like, what kind of world would we expect? I am also a little, and I apologize for going on too long, I'll wrap it up here. I'm also skeptical. Sometimes atheists will say, well, look, if there were no God, this world with natural selection and all the suffering, like this is the kind of world we would expect. But I'm skeptical of that too, because I think if atheism is true, we might expect nothing to exist, or a world that only has hydrogen atoms, or a world without conscious life. If the fine-tuning argument works, and I know you and Joe did a little video about that. Joe put the argument somewhat high, a powerful argument. Then it's like a world that's like this is very unexpected on atheism. So I apologize. I don't want to dump too much. I definitely want us to have more back and forth, but it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I want to respond to a few things that you said there. The first thing was about epistemic distance, which we haven't spoken about yet. You say, well, maybe the reason that God puts a distance between himself and us is for the same reason that a parent might distance themselves from a child, such that they don't feel constantly overbearing. They need the freedom to be able to choose to do things for their own sake, not because they feel like somebody's watching over their shoulder. But pay close attention to what I'm asking for here. I'm not asking for a constant and continual washing over of divine presence that follows me around everywhere I go and I'm unable to avoid seeing. I'm just asking for something, just once, just one experience in my life that speaks to the existence of a creator of the universe.
But
once.
Sure, but
this would not be overbearing. This would not be enough to make me to impinge upon my freedom. This would not be enough to make me feel that every time I was doing a moral decision, I had someone watching over my shoulder. This would just be enough to establish the existence. In the same way that a parent may distance themselves from a child in order to allow that child to grow up freely. Nobody likes a parent that hovers over their child for all their lives. But I can assure you that that child has had some experience in their life where they do think, where they've become convinced that their parent does in fact exist. This will be because they've at least once in their experience had direct experience of that parent. That's all I'm asking for here. So I don't think that objection works. Equally with the orphans, sure, the equivalent of the orphans saying like, look, our parents were terrible, so we have no parents. That obviously doesn't follow. But you're asking me here, like, or the premise of this is why I'm not a Christian, and no Christian God is the kind of God that would be subject to that kind of analogy. Finally, you said that we can imagine a world in which there is suffering as being more worthwhile because there are certain goods which are parasitic upon certain evils. You can't have compassion without suffering. You can't have forgiveness without evil and immorality and these kinds of things. And so God actualizes a world in which these evils exist in order to allow for these second order goods. Now, there was a question that I asked in a podcast that myself and Trent and Cameron and Joe did recently, but I more asked it to Cameron, but I'm interested to ask it to you now because we didn't really discuss it from your perspective, which is when somebody says, well, I'm glad we live in a world where there is pain and suffering because this allows us to have things like compassion and bravery, and it allows us to have forgiveness, which wouldn't be capable, which wouldn't be possible if we didn't have these evils to respond to. The example I gave yesterday was that of Martin Luther King Jr., who is widely considered to be a good man. Okay, why is he good? Because he overcame the evils of racism. Sure. Are we glad to find ourselves in a world where there has been this kind of racism so that we can have the good of something like overcoming it with Martin Luther King? Or would we rather live in a world where there were no racism in the first place and no need for Martin Luther King? Forgiveness and compassion, these things are only good insofar as they overcome some evil. I'd rather do without the evil and without the need to overcome it. Saying that it's good to have the evil so that we can get good out of overcoming it is just like saying that we should be very glad of the existence of cancer, because if we didn't have cancer, then we wouldn't be able to reach the good of cancer research and people coming up with chemotherapy. This seems to me ridiculous, and I imagine that you would take problem with that analogy, because surely, at least in the case of something like cancer research and possibly with the Martin Luther King example, I mean, would you rather live in a world where there had been no racism and no need for Martin Luther King, or in a world where there was racism, so that we get the good of combating racism? That just to me seems bizarre.
I think the way to answer that is to say, well, imagine suppose we lived in an alternative world that did not have racism, but it had every other evil. Perhaps it's a world where everyone belonged to the same race, and we had all the same evils we still have right now. I suspect your probability about God wouldn't change that much, given all the other evils that exist. So there's so many other evils. You'd rather live in a world with or without racism. There's still so many other evils associated with human beings. That question you asked to me is like asking, wouldn't the world be better without human beings? Like, surely our world without genocide and rape and human evils, wouldn't the world just be better without human beings? And my answer is no, it would not be better, actually, because humans also bring unique goods with them, and the harm inflicted by the evils can be conquered and overcome. But ultimately, when I hear your protestation, and it's a rightful protestation you have against evil, you speak about it as if it's this objective thing that's wrong, that we have a duty to remove, and I have a hard time squaring that on an atheistic worldview, the views of either there being objective good and objective right and wrong, or of intrinsic human dignity. Humans have this value that non-humans do not have, which informs many of our moral judgments, to prefer human welfare over the welfare of other creatures. So that's the other bright spot in the evil that I can't explain without God.
I feel like this is a misguided objection. The reason is that what I'm doing here is I'm offering what might sometimes be called an internal critique of Christianity. Mm-hmm. I'm not claiming that there exist objective moral standards. You are. So what I'm saying is that for me, the problem of evil and suffering is not a problem. It's exactly what I expect to find in the world. For the Christian, it is a problem, because you are asserting the existence of objective goodness, and you are asserting the existence of an objectively good God. And so when I say that, like, God wouldn't allow this evil to take place, and you might say, well, as an atheist, how can you even call it evil? Well, this is what I'm asking you to describe, because you're the one claiming that there is an objective moral standard, and I'm saying that if there is an objective moral standard, then these examples of evil and suffering, or apparent evil and suffering, you are required to incorporate these into your worldview of objective morality. I don't know, it's a bit like...
required?
It's a bit like, well, yeah, you must be. If you want to contend that there's a moral God, you need to include within the permissibility of that moral God the suffering that we see in the world, which I think you would trivially agree that that's something that you have to do. But can I just say, it's like, imagine you were having a discussion with like a flat earther or something. Not to make a comparison, I'm not saying this is anything like that.
I've done an episode on flat earth. It's interesting.
Yeah, I've done the same. It's quite good fun. But I can imagine somebody kind of saying like, imagine you're the flat earther and I'm criticizing the flat earth hypothesis, and I say, well, if the earth is flat, then, how do planes sort of get from this part of the world to this part of the world. That it would seem like it would be ridiculous to suggest that they could fly over this entire huge disk or around the big ice wall at the other side. And you said something like, but I thought you believed in a globe Earth. So, how can you say, that there's a problem with these planes flying around the equator because you believe it's a globe, right? It's like, yeah, but I'm criticizing your position. You think there's the flat Earth, and so you have to explain why you have this, how you solve this problem of the planes going around. So in the same way, when you say you're a Christian, I say I'm an atheist, I say, well, then how do you explain the problem on Christianity of the existence of evil and suffering? And you're saying, well, I thought you were an atheist. Where are you getting this evil and suffering thing from? It's like, well, I'm actually just criticizing your position here. You're the one who has to account for it, not me. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying, that you're trying to say, well, you could have a worldview that doesn't require objective good or objective evil. You're just saying that the Christian worldview, you're not going to adopt it because it has these inconsistencies in it. But I'm not sure that really works, because I still think that there are moral duties being smuggled in here, that you're not just saying, hey, it's really strange that you have this inconsistent view, because people have all kinds of strange, inconsistent views. I mean, I enjoy comic books, and in comic books, there's something called retroactive continuity. It's necessary because comic book plots get totally inconsistent with one another. Superheroes have one power one day, next issue a totally different power. You say, hey, what about this or that? And it's interesting. Well, we don't give it that much of a second thought. It's not as important. But the idea that I ought to be consistent in how I treat animals, for example, who are in factory farms, or God, if God exists, God ought to act in a certain way. And now, so it seems to me you're still trying to posit, okay, well, there's this contradiction in view here. But if it's my system, if I have the whole system, and then I say, well, Alex, so here are these other elements like God redeeming evil, compensating people with happiness. To me, it's not just you're saying your system's incoherent, because then you say, well, I think the probability of all of this being true is low. And so it's not just an internal critique. You're saying it doesn't map to reality, even if I can make it consistent with other goods, with reasons, with things like that.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do this. I think you can. I think you can offer some great responses to the problem of evil,
okay,
and explain why it is that God would allow evil. The only thing I'm pushing back on is specifically what you said, that me making the case from the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, if you prefer, is somehow a problem because I can't say that there is objective evil in the world. I don't need to. All I need to say is that if there is such thing as objective morality, it needs to offer an account of what would become these evils, this kind of suffering. Then it would need to offer an account. Mm-hmm. So say it's not a problem for me. It's a problem for you. I'm not saying you can't do that.
Right.
I'm just saying that it's not right to say that I can't really make this criticism because I don't believe in objective morality. I'm saying you believe in objective morality,
right,
so you need to offer an account of how objective morality will permit the kind of evils and sufferings that we see. For example, animal suffering, which is potentially the best thing to talk about. Now, when I speak about animal suffering, I'm not talking about the suffering that we inflict upon animals in factory farms, because this is quite easy to explain. Human beings are free creatures, they're sinful creatures. They commit horrendous evils. What I'm talking about is the suffering of animals in the wild. You can imagine a situation of a tree falling over and trapping a deer's leg, and that deer spends the rest of its life in confusion and agony until it starves. If Christianity is true and suffering is redeemed, we need an account of this. Now, you could just say this deer goes to heaven. Feels like a bit of a disposal problem to me, but you could say that. There's still an interesting question about whether any being could have the right to do this kind of thing. An interesting point that's raised by David Benatar is that there seems to be a difference between our right to inflict suffering, if it's to prevent further suffering, or if it's to provide good. In other words, if I have to unconsensually inflict suffering upon somebody, but it's the only thing I can do to prevent much greater suffering to them, it seems like I'm justified in doing it. It seems like I have the right to inflict it. If I can break their arm to stop them from drowning because I need to kind of pull them through a gap where water's filling up, I'm allowed to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering. But if I could break somebody's arm unconsensually, and it doesn't prevent greater suffering, it just gives them something really good, Maybe it gives them like an encyclopedic knowledge of geography, and they want to be a geography professor. Or maybe it just gives them this wonderful feeling of elation, or just some positive good. It seems that unconsensually, I don't have the right to inflict that. Even if it's something that's kind of going to make them better off, even if they would say that they'd rather have an encyclopedic knowledge of geography rather than have a functioning arm for a while, I can't unconsensually inflict this suffering to bring about a great good in the way that I can inflict a suffering to bring about a great evil. So there's an interesting question about, even if we are being compensated for our suffering, whether or not somebody should have the right to inflict that suffering just on the grounds that it's going to be compensated for. There's a club called the Bullingdon Club, which is famous in Oxford for being this kind of depraved gang of teenage Etonites. The kind of people who end up going on to be our prime ministers. Boris Johnson and David Cameron were both members of this club. It has a reputation for these young, rich kids, before they were in the public eye, they go for dinner and they would just trash the place. They would be completely, they'd cause a racket. They would rip the place apart. They'd flip over the tables. They'd tear down the wallpaper. And the idea was they were so rich that what they would do is they would just throw some money at the person who owned the place and throw them way more money than the meal was worth, and way more money than it takes to fix up the place, as if to say, like, yeah, you're going to be fine with this because, yeah, sure, we came into your place and we disrespected you and we completely wrecked your restaurant, but we've just paid you enough money to fix it and then some. I still think that they've wronged them, even if they've compensated them for something. As long as it's being done unconsensually and in a way that a person, doesn't get a say in, I still think they've done something wrong there, even if they're being compensated. And that's even if we grant that these animals will be compensated in the afterlife, that there is such thing as a dear heaven, which I must say I'm quite skeptical of. If there's not, we've got an even bigger problem. How on earth can we explain the meaning behind the suffering of this deer with its leg trapped under the tree that's starving in confused agony? I don't know what you would say.
I have two thoughts. One, I don't think the analogy works, because for God allowing suffering and the boys there in tearing up the club, they don't own that club. Like, if someone came to my house and tore it up and then gave me a bunch of money, I'd be highly inconvenienced nonetheless to have to fix everything. I'd still be mad, even if I was grateful for the money, because it's my house, not theirs. But this is God's house, so he's sovereign over it. And so I think it changes the analogy a lot. And then number two, hearing you talk, I feel like, wait, we're shifting gears. I wouldn't have the right to do this. I wouldn't be justified in doing this. So when I point that out to you, say, well, I'm not saying that, I'm not affirming this. It's an internal problem for you. But then when you describe the world, I feel like you're slipping back into using this objective kind of language to describe the way that they are. So for me, when I see this, it still doesn't provide a defeater that God is, that he's not all powerful. Like, you've posed one question: how do we explain the deer, the suffering of the deer? Here are some possible options. I don't know how plausible they are. I can do the same thing, like with my argument from intrinsic human dignity. Why is it the case that we can experiment on rats, kill pigs when we need to promote human flourishing, but we don't do that to human infants, even though they are not cognitively superior to these beings? Like, pigs are very intelligent, rats are intelligent. And if we say that for infants, well, you could make it extrinsic. It's just how we care about them. Well, when our feelings run out, that's dangerous for them. But if it's intrinsic just to the fact that members of the human species have value, non-humans do not, to me, while with animal suffering, I can give you explanations you find more or less plausible, I don't think atheism can do that for human dignity when it comes to the reason why. Because even when we talk to suffering, it's so interesting. I think that human suffering is something of a worse quality than animal suffering, because humans are special. So I think the problem cuts back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to think that sort of qua instance of suffering is experienced the same by humans and other animals. I think that the thing that would make a human being worth more than a pig wouldn't be that its suffering somehow counts for more, but that there's more of it and there's a bigger depth of it, and there are different kinds of it that exist within the human, such that the human's suffering is not worth more than the pig's suffering, but the human is worth more than the pig. But I wanted to just, again, respond, because you said that, again, I'm kind of injecting this language. You said that I was talking about why would God have the right to do this. Maybe I can just rephrase this, and maybe it will because I feel like there still must be some confusion here. The point that I'm making there is saying something like, if you want to assert that God can allow this deer in his house to go through this suffering because he's being compensated for, this is being compensated
and
for.
I agree that you can rewrite it to have an emotivist description. All I do is...
I'm not rewriting it to, like, to be an emotivist account. What I'm saying is that the criticism I was making is that you appear committed to the view then that God has the right to do this. Now, you seem to think that, but that's the only point I was making. When I say, like, there's a question here about whether we have the right to inflict suffering in order to bring about some great good, what I'm basically saying there, in other words, is, look, Trent, if you want to use this response that it's okay that this deer is suffering because it will be compensated in the afterlife, you're committed to the view that God has the right to inflict suffering upon creatures as long as he makes up for it, as long as he, throws the money at you at the end of the day in the way that the Bullingdon Club boys throw the money at the owner of the restaurant. This seems to me like quite an asinine idea. I don't think that that's how it works. You also talked about...
Wait, so it seems to you, what you're saying is you just don't agree with it?
Yeah,
that God can allow us to suffer if he compensates us, and your objection is, well, that's asinine.
I don't see myself as a part of God's house. At best, I would see myself as a visitor within God's house who had no choice but to be in God's house. If I was in my own house and I dragged somebody into my house through no choice of their own and then forced them to undergo some suffering and then threw some money at them and said, I have the right to do this because firstly, this is my house, and secondly, I've compensated for it. So if anything, you should be grateful. I think this would be gross.
Right, because when human beings exhibit that kind of autonomy over other human beings, we call that slavery. But when I tell my kids... What?
It's funny that, isn't it?
Right, but if I bent you over my knee and whapped your behind, I would be a crazy person.
You get a lot of views, I think.
Yeah, maybe not the ones we want. But if I were to discipline my own children, it changes dramatically because I do have moral authority over them in virtue of having caused their existence and in being given the responsibility to raise them. And so in virtue of that, then if God causes our existence and he is the absolute source of goodness itself, then it still makes sense, then the analogy doesn't hold up. But for me, I am seeing the suffering and this other things, I still think they're the plausible answers. But when we go back and we talk about suffering across these different fields, well, do you think that in the ethical life, our actions should promote the flourishing of the human species over other species?
I'm not sure I would commit myself to a principle, kind of put that blandly. Not blandly, I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean sort of put so generically. I'm not sure, because there may be situations in which promoting some level of non-human suffering is worth focusing on rather than promoting some lower level of human suffering or something like this. But if you mean like all other things being equal, should we promote the welfare of humans over animals? A qualified yes, because of course I don't think that like a human's well-being is intrinsically more valuable than a pig's or a cow's. I just think it's of a different kind. Like I'm trying to think about how best to explain this. When I said earlier that a human's suffering is not worth more than a pig's suffering, but the human is worth more because of the kinds of suffering it's capable of. When we talk about promoting human welfare over animal welfare, I'm imagining something like this. I'd say, like, if you had humans who were like pigs in every respect, in terms of their cognitive ability and stuff, then maybe we should be promoting their welfare equally. But because they're not, we don't.
Oh, wait a minute. I want to make sure I understood what you just said. Because I believe that human beings who are permanently at the cognitive level of certain non-human animals, so these would be severely mentally handicapped human beings, I believe their welfare should still far and above exceed the welfare we give to the non-human animals. I believe the severely mentally handicapped should be given they have far more dignity and deserve more respect than non-human animals, even if they are at the same functional level. And that's solely in virtue of their humanity. Do you agree or disagree with that thesis?
Of course, as an emotivist, I agree. It's kind of, again, a qualified agreement, because being an ethical emotivist, ethical statements for an emotivist are essentially just expressions of emotion that don't contain any truth value. And I can explain why it is I'm of the psychological predisposition to prefer the well-being of a human being over a pig. I don't know if I can justify that, but as an emotivist, I'm not dealing with a realm of objective ethics that can be justified at all. All I can talk about is like my emotive response.
But I guess then what's hard is, let's say here's my Christian ethical worldview, and It includes this moral proposition. God has the right to allow us to suffer if he compensates us in the afterlife. And I hear from you, that's asinine. So if that's just an emotional reply, like, that makes me feel bad and I don't like it, in the world of moral discourse, I can reply with, I don't care, because it's not a reason.
But of course, for me, for an emotivist, that is, ethical debate, ethical statements, ethical propositions that are put forward are just highly evolved apes expressing themselves at each other. But for you, that's not what's going on.
So, right? Yeah, we're not just flinging poo at each other.
So it's not so much. It's not kind of a problem for me as long as I'm willing to just admit that that's all that's going on.
Right, and so and this will get down to a crux of our disagreement about the nature of human beings and of morality. And I do think it's important for people to understand. Obviously, you and I are sharing our differences because there are atheists and non-theists who don't believe in God and also reject your ethical worldview. And there's theists who reject my ethical worldview.
Sure.
But I think it's helpful for us to engage one another because especially if a more robust ethic of human dignity, moral realism, at least points stronger at God, that gives me reason to go in that direction if the alternatives like emotivism are, for me, it would point back to Christianity. If these are the other alternatives that are most live on the table away from God, like emotivism, I don't find it plausible. Like they're not coherent. Like, for example, if ethical descriptions are just expressions of emotional states, it doesn't seem to make very much sense of moral argument. Like, I can make an argument like, murder is wrong. If murder is wrong, then it is wrong for my friend to commit murder. Therefore, it is wrong for my friend to commit murder, which seems hard to do under emotivism.
Yes. So A.J. Ayer addresses this in chapter 7 of Language, Truth, and Logic, which is kind of the place where the emotivist school of thought really got off the ground. And he pointed out that what most people call moral debate is a lot of the time not moral debate at all. If you're having a debate about, say, the ethics of gun ownership or something, somebody might say, well, guns kill a lot of people. And someone else says, no, guns actually kill less people than you think. And more people are saved by guns than are killed by guns. And you're more likely to die in a swimming pool. But you could just put a fence up. These kinds of, this debate, and this is the kind of topics that will often be discussed, these are not moral claims. These are just descriptive, factual claims.
I disagree. Like with abortion, it boils down to you should be allowed to directly end a fetus's life. You should not be allowed to do that.
But look at what so much of the discussion around abortion is. We'll talk about, is it a human being, yes or no? Like, is it sentient? Can it feel? Is it viable outside of a womb? This kind of things. Is it relevantly similar to it? These are descriptive claims. Now, of course, there is a moral element. I'm not saying that this isn't a problem. It is kind of a problem for emotivism that it makes it difficult to make sense of moral discussion. What I'm saying is the problem isn't as big as I think you're making it out to be, because so much of moral discussion, we're actually arguing about descriptive qualities. Pay attention the next time you're having a moral debate with somebody and notice how many of the things you're arguing about, you'll be like, let's look at the facts, let's look up the statistics. You're talking about descriptive claims.
And I would say, like, when I've had abortion, I can't count the number of times I've heard, yeah, it's a baby, but I can do what I want with my body. That would be a differing moral claim, not a differing descriptive claim.
So, of course, within the debates, you do still have this moral disagreement that you need to make sense of. For the emotivist, this is just emotive states kind of clashing up against each other. But, of course, people's emotive states can change. As you can kind of, what would be called moral debate by someone who's not an emotivist would be best described by the emotivist as a situation in which somebody kind of feels something but comes to realize that they might actually have another feeling which kind of...
Do you think we can control our feelings?
No, I don't think so.
That makes it very interesting to hold people responsible for their moral beliefs then.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's one of the big problems of, I wouldn't say one of the big problems of atheism, but certainly one of the big problems of determinism, of lack of free will, is it completely undermines traditional morality and moral responsibility.
And that's the thing for me. Like, when you, and I understand how you've cached things here. Like, it seems like I have my view, and within this coherent, objective moral view, God has a moral responsibility to not let deer suffer or not let certain bad things happen. But I do think part of that bleeds into a deep-seated intuition that human beings uniquely are morally responsible for their actions and can be held accountable. That if I say to you, like, and I'm taking your ethical veganism real seriously. I am going to dive into it and pick one side or the other. But if I just said to you, Alex, I just don't care. If they're in fact, I like meat and I don't care, I think you would say that I'm a morally blameworthy, intellectually lazy person who's not taking serious moral matters into consideration. But I think, like, honestly, most tigers don't really care. The meat just tastes good to them. So I do. So for me as a Christian, like, one reason I am a Christian is back to that uniqueness of human beings. I don't see how atheism really explains not just our dignity, how we should be treated, but how we ought to treat others. I find that hard to explain on atheism.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to unpack there. Firstly,
Sure.
I wouldn't quite, I think you slightly mischaracterize exactly the point that I'm making, which is not, I didn't say something like, I can't remember exactly what you said there. You said something like, God kind of doesn't have the warrant to inflict suffering upon animals or something like this, as if I'm making an argument that God can't do this. I'm not saying that God shouldn't do this. I'm not saying God doesn't have the right to inflict the suffering. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is that I'd like an explanation that takes the form of saying why he has the justification. Of course, if there is a perfectly loving God, then he does have justification for the things that he does, because there'd be no way that he couldn't do, right? So what I'm saying, I'm not saying God doesn't have this justification. I'm kind of asking a question of, like, well, if I have to assume there is such a justification to be a Christian, like,
well, it sounds like you're saying God doesn't have a right to do it because because it seems like no such justification exists.
I'm saying it seems to me, I guess it would seem to me that there is no such justification. At least I have no reason to think that there's a justification as an atheist. Of course, I guess if you're a Christian, you can again do the modus ponens, modus tollens shift and say that as long as I'm confident that a God exists, I know that there will be some reason for this. That's fine. You can do that, I guess. But I'm trying to remember the second thing you said while you were talking about.
It's just the uniqueness of moral responsibility.
Of human beings. Oh yes, you said that if you just said, like, look, I just don't care.
I'm responsible for the moral beliefs I have.
This is kind of going to depend on your metaethical theory, right? Because if you said that, then I'd be like, Trent, what are you talking about? You're a Catholic. Like, you believe that these moral imperatives are important. But I meet a great deal of people, for instance, who are ethical egoists. Mm. They say that I don't believe that ethics exists objectively. I think people just chase after what they want to do, and that there's no problem with this. There's no morality. There's no anything. And so they say to me, they come to my talks on veganism, and they listen, and they say, look, I like what you're saying, but what if I just don't care? What if I just don't agree? Now, I could tell them that they're being kind of intellectually lazy, or I could say that they're not taking it seriously or whatever. But I think these people are being honest and serious. It's like, this is a serious position that needs to be taken into account. So I might argue that they're not as egoistic as they think they are. I might try to talk them through it, but, like, it is a serious argument. So if like an ethical egoist said to me, "Oh, I just don't care," I'd be like, okay, well, let's see if you do care. I mean, would you? It
sounds like you try to argue in their own system.
Exactly. That's exactly what I do. So in the same way that
and I see the merit in that. But do you agree that sometimes when we have ethical disagreements with people, a person's ethical system is so stacked towards defending immorality, one has to show the system is false?
But so can I, when you said a moment ago that something like a lack of free will undermines traditional moral responsibility,
yes, yeah.
I think you're right. And so what we're just left with here is descriptive statements. We're just kind of left with descriptivity, because there's no moral responsibility. There's no ethics in the traditional sense if we throw off free will. So what we're left with is the descriptive. So what I do from that perspective is I look at other people's descriptive claims. I look at facts about the things that they're claiming. So I see a man who says, I am a Catholic, I believe there is an objective moral truth, I care about suffering in some circumstances, and I eat factory farmed meat. And I say that somewhere lurking in there, I think there might be a descriptive inconsistency. And that's what I'm doing in a situation like that. And it's just like the situation of trying to are we running out of time? Q&A.
Yeah, we'll do.
Let's Q&A shortly. Just like earlier when I was saying that I'm kind of making an internal critique of Christianity when I talk about evil and suffering. Like as an atheist, how can I talk about evil and suffering? I'm making an internal critique. Similarly, when I kind of make moral statements, because your big criticism here seems to be that I'm somehow injecting or smuggling in these moral assumptions. And what I'm saying is I'm working on the immoral assumptions that you're giving me and seeing if they're descriptively consistent. Or see if they lead to kind of descriptive.
And I will be honest with you, Alex, I do feel like, I know you speak as if, morality is about emotivist descriptions we have from each other. And you say, well, why hasn't God revealed himself to me? I honestly believe the zeal that you have to challenge me, Matt Dillahunty, other people, to be consistent and do what feels right to you emotionally. I'm telling you, man, I feel like Romans 2:14-15 says, there are the Gentiles to whom the law was not given, but the law was written on their hearts. And so they will be judged upon that, which will either accuse or excuse them. So I do think that, and this is echoing what Joe Schmid said in a discussion we had earlier, that I believe you've complained to not have this relationship with God, but I feel like you're even more in tune with pursuing the good and the true in the face of serious opposition than many other people. And so you do have that in ways you may not see as clearly now. But yeah, so I guess it's interesting. It looks like being Christian or not Christian, it's like there's a creator and then revealed in Christ. It's like we're stuck here in this limbo, like, is the creator good or not? That's basically what we focused on, essentially. That seems to be the biggest crux for you, that like if this could be overcome, maybe we could span the whole gap. I don't know.
Well, of course, the problem of evil doesn't sufficiently respond to, shall we say, theism broadly. It doesn't on its own give us good reason to think that there's no creator. Like you say, this is where your orphan analogy works perfectly. It's to say, like, just to say that there's a God who's uncaring or malicious or something doesn't mean there's no God. But it does explain why I'm not a Christian. Because, of course, if we insert a premise that if there is a God, he's a loving God, then if you have something that undermines the existence of a loving God, you have something that undermines the existence of God.
Yeah, and I would say just the moral features that I focus on, especially moral responsibility, intrinsic dignity, things like that, objective morality, that moves me from just an unmoved mover to the God of Christianity's revelation of Christ. But, favorite fun time now, Q&A.
I think it's some Q&A, yes.
So we can line people up. Where would you like them?
Like
over there.
There's a line on the floor just here. If the first speaker could, we basically we've got a camera and we've set it to focus on that line. So if you could make sure you're just lined up on that thing. You'll also be handed a microphone by our wonderful cameraman Batuzzi. Hey, look, he is in the video after all. He's going to hand you a microphone. That microphone isn't going to come through the speaker. It's just for the people watching at home, as it were.
Hey guys.
Yeah, okay, I think we can get into it.
Hi, awesome chat. Trent, I kind of have a question for you. So a lot of this talk seemed to be focused on, the types of loving God critiques from Problem of Evil, stuff like that. And so you mentioned that the intrinsic dignity of human beings is something that drives you towards an understanding of God as, something that exists, being loving and all those things. But so when you look at something like, the classic Leviticus 25 Old Testament, you shall, own slaves, you may take them from the lands around you.
Right.
When you see that piece of data, is that evidence against Christianity being the manifestation that God, because you can have all the things you talked about without Christianity, and it seems like that would be evidence against specifically the Christian claims.
Sure. And what I would say is that it does depend a little bit on where I am in the timeline, so to speak, to evaluate the evidence. So, well, the question's recorded, so I guess I don't have to repeat it. But well, I guess I will. If intrinsic human dignity points me towards Christianity, what about aspects of Christianity that appear to be in conflict with intrinsic human dignity? Seems to be the essence of the question. And so I would say, at least looking at it from my current perspective, I would say that Scripture is an account of God's revelation to human beings. And so that revelation is something of a progressive nature. Pope Benedict XVI talked about how in the Old Testament, there are things that were temporary and imperfect. So you had things like the toleration of legal slavery. You had things like allowing for divorce, for example, when Jesus later said, well, no, they're made to be man and woman to be one flesh. I find in the Old Testament, we see a lot of evils are tolerated, in many cases, to prevent greater evils. So Aquinas said that divorce was tolerated in the Old Testament to prevent the greater evil of wife murder, for example. And Jesus says you have hard hearts, things like that. The question of slavery is a complex one. I have 2 chapters on it in my book, Hard Sayings, The Catholic Approach to Answering Bible Difficulties. But I will say there that slavery in and of itself is not intrinsically evil, depending on how you define it. So if you define slavery as compelling someone to work and not paying them and not allowing them to leave, well, we do that sometimes with convicts in prison. We make them pick up trash along the highway and they can't leave and we don't pay them. Technically, that's slavery, but it's just. It's a due punishment for what has occurred. Now, I think in many cases throughout human history, slavery was unjust, like the transatlantic slave trade, for example. There could be other cases recorded in the Bible where it describes people who are stricken with famine saying, please save us from this famine, we shall sell ourselves in slavery to you. Because remember, in the ancient world, there was no lines of credit. For many people in the ancient world, you had an alternative between starvation or perpetual servitude, and many would choose servitude. So I would say then that the Bible takes human beings in their broken condition, and God progressively reveals himself and leads them to moral perfection. And so we see this with slavery, we see this with other evils, and God ultimately leads us, he leads people into the greater awareness of human dignity. So that even in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the slave laws in the Old Testament were actually, they treated, in many respects, those who were in servitude were treated more humanely than those in other corresponding areas. But to understand the human dignity, then when Jesus says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. He provides a greater enlightening of human dignity, whereas in Leviticus, it says in Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but neighbor meant fellow Jew. But then Jesus shines more light in this progressive revelation to say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and neighbor is every other human being. So I do not believe the Bible contradicts human dignity, but it does reveal a progressive understanding of it to human beings and their moral conduct and things like that. But I think that is the fair question you ask, and I apologize if I can't give a more thorough response to it. But I would recommend my book on that for more. But I don't see that as an ultimate conflict.
For sure, thanks. Just have a really, really quick follow-up to that. So given kind of the status of the Old Testament and the New Testament, do you think there's anything that could have been in the Old Testament that would be evidence against God from the perspective of human dignity? Like, is there something that could have been in the Old Testament being commanded that would have, wouldn't be able to explain in the same way that you explain slavery?
It's always hard to answer a hypothetical question. Like, could there have been X that would count against something being divine? I suppose if there were something in the Old Testament that said explicitly not to believe something that would later come to be revealed in the New Testament, that would be very contradictory and difficult to reconcile. But that would be the first example off the top of my head. So
cool, thanks.
Hey, okay, so I know we all value, intellectual inquiry and curiosity and all that. I guess this question is more for Trent. I could see a scenario in which we have a person who doesn't have the intellectual curiosity and I guess would succumb to more like intellectual laziness that we talked about a little earlier. But they would get the Christian thing right? They would believe in God, right? Whereas someone like Alex or some of the people here really have studied these things and have been on their knees asking God, reveal yourself to me, right? I guess, and then at the end of it, like, you're faced with some sort of punishment. I don't know what you think of hell or anything, but like, you're faced with some sort of punishment at the end for not believing, even though you went through all this, right? So I guess, what do you make of that? Like, how does that make sense within the Christian worldview?
Sounds like you're asking, would it be fair for a Christian to not engage in a lot of intellectual inquiry, come to know God, and be in heaven, and an atheist engage in significant intellectual inquiry, reject God, and then go to hell? It seems very unfair.
More or less, yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess what I would say here is that I believe that God will judge people based on revelation they have been given and based on their culpability. So at least that's my belief as a Catholic. There's different theistic beliefs. And so the Catholic Church teaches in the Second Vatican Council that it is possible for those who sincerely seek out the truth and goodness to be saved. That I believe people will be judged based on things that they are culpable for, things that they know. But I don't think there's anything inherently, I don't like this idea that relationship with God, it's like, oh, a really smart person went through all the arguments, and it's like they deserve it a bit more than a not smart person who didn't read Graham Oppie and didn't read all of these things. I mentioned this, I alluded to this a little with the problem of divine hiddenness. It can also be the case that really smart, Michael Shermer, and this is not a knock on very smart atheists. They are very smart, and I disagree with them. But it is possible for very smart people to believe counterintuitive things precisely because they're so smart. And so there is an expression, too smart for one's own good. Now, I don't believe people should be anti-intellectual by any means. But I mean, would I blame someone who doesn't read philosophical articles, who believes in free will, and think that a philosopher who's really studied everything and doesn't believe in free will is somehow superior in some respect? I mean, I give them credit for reading, but I don't blame someone who just believes what seems obvious to them, and they didn't jump through all the philosophical hoops. I think they're right about free will. So I think that people will be, God will judge them based on their particular kind of culpability, but it's not necessarily a virtue. Just because you've done a lot of intellectual legwork, you could have made some very serious cognitive mistakes simply because you have a lot of intellectual firepower that can drive you down a direction many other people normally wouldn't go because they have common sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess a follow-up to that would be, so I guess you could have a situation in which someone who has studied the problems goes to hell, and then someone who just kind of accidentally ends up in Christianity goes to heaven, I guess.
Well, what do you do with someone who studies morality and reads every moral philosopher and comes to the conclusion that they should be amoral because they believe in some kind of moral error theory or nihilism, just because they've done a lot of intellectual legwork to defend their nihilistic viewpoint? Well, they could still be wrong and still do intellectual legwork to justify things that aren't good.
But I think the point is surely that it's like what I was saying earlier, which is that may be true for an atheist, but for the Christian, you'd expect somebody who honestly engaged with this kind of stuff to eventually find God, I think is what I'm saying. It's not fair, in other words, that one person might end up in hell because they've rejected God's existence, but they've kind of approached the question honestly and done the reading properly.
Right.
And so I think the charge might be that it's unfair that such a person can go to hell and not
and
have
I don't
been
think
guided
someone
to the
I don't
truth.
think someone will go to hell because of a mere cognitive error.
Right.
Okay, so I believe that many people reach an incorrect belief about God through cognitive errors, incorrect inferences. I believe that the judgment will be one on their moral decisions, what they've pursued in life. But the problem is it's sneaky, right? Because people often engage in moral wrongdoing with sometimes very clever rationalizations.
Yeah.
So sometimes our cognitive errors are bound up in our moral errors, and it can be hard to separate the two.
Yeah. I think it's a good response. I just want to make sure that we're
No,
being
that's
clear
fair.
A brief question for each of you. For Trent, if you could, and I know you just recently said you don't like hypothetical questions, if you could illustrate what the world would have to look like for you for theodicies thereof to not be personally convincing, even though they could be possible, you would find it improbable. And for Alex, I know that there has been a time in your life before now where you've been an emotivist, before considering yourself a utilitarian. I'm curious at this point how there is a complex blend of the two, or if there isn't. Perhaps you may say that, to say that suffering is wrong, you could just say suffering yuck and pleasure yay. But I'm curious to hear it from you.
I mean, I can answer fairly quickly. I think that, the utilitarian intuitions that I used to harbor and still do harbor, I now just interpret under an emotivist framework. I thought, suffering, even at the time, I never quite called myself a utilitarian because, sorry, I said I'd be brief, because I thought to myself, well, yeah, I don't like suffering. And generally speaking, I think that minimizing suffering seems to be like an advisable or a good thing to do. There's something pulling me towards that. But I was always vastly unimpressed with any attempt to actually identify goodness with pleasure or identify badness with suffering. All of the traditional critiques of utilitarianism I thought were sound. But at the same time, I had this intuition that mapped onto utilitarianism. That's why John Stuart Mill thinks that people who were not utilitarian throughout all of history were, I can't remember the phrase he uses, but living by a standard not yet recognized, or something like this. He believed they basically were utilitarians, they just kind of didn't realize it yet. So I had these intuitions, and I guess I was like, in practice, I'm a utilitarian, and that's all you need to know to understand the kind of moral decisions that I would make. Now I just think that, I still think suffering is bad, but I just mean by that now something more like boo suffering.
Yeah, and so your question was a hypothetical, what would a world have to look like where I feel like a defense or theodicy against the problem of evil would not be successful? And I guess I would say an obvious case would just be maximal suffering that is unrelenting. So if there is a world where creatures suffer at their maximum and the suffering is unrelenting, so it takes place at all times, I don't think a theodicy or defense would be possible in that kind of world. Though it made me think of something interesting between the two of us. It'd be like the Hypotheticals asked me, when would theodicy stop working? And then for you, it might be like, when does it start working? Like, I can imagine I could start with a world where the problem of evil does work for me, this maximal suffering. And then I dial the suffering back bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit until I get to, that world. Now we're at a world where a theodicy and defense can work. It's funny, we can almost do the reverse with you. We could start with a world of maximal pleasure that's unrelenting. And then we start turning the dial and adding suffering. And then I wonder what point it would be, or you would say, oh, nope, problem of evil can't be overcome.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, you can turn the dial either way with us. I don't know.
Yeah, I think either of us would find it difficult to kind of put a line in here. But I think that if I were to argue something like, well, I don't know where that line is, but I think that the world we find ourselves in today is so suffused with suffering that it's well on this side of the line. I think I can more easily do that than you can say, well, I don't know where that line is, but the world we find ourselves in is so good and so full of pleasure and goodness that it puts us well on this side of the line. I think that's easier for me to do than it is for you to do.
Yeah, and I would say that there are still the unexplainable elements. Where
I also wonder, as a slight modification of the question about kind of theodicy, is there, just broadly speaking, like a condition of falsifiability that you're working with, is there some kind of observation that you could find? And I'm thinking about something a bit more realistic. So people often say something like the bones of Jesus or something. If they found the bones of Jesus, Christianity would just be false. But is there anything realistically that you think while you're reading and looking at and observing the world that you might find, whether it be in the stars or under a microscope or in a book somewhere, that would make you go, okay, this is false?
Well, I think if there were some archaeological discoveries that showed, for example, that the original disciples recanted of their belief, or something like that, like how in Mormonism, the original witnesses of the golden plates, 3 of them left the church. I think 2 of them came back. That lowers my confidence in Mormonism. But finding historical, I agree, the bones of Jesus, like having the Jesus' bones. It could be in a bone box that says Jesus of Nazareth, and that could lower probability a bit. So that it's not unrealistic. It wouldn't be a foolproof, but it might make one doubt. But maybe some kind of historical document.
Yeah, like a early manuscript of the gospel that says at the beginning of it something about it being fictional or something like that.
Yeah, or that we've seen this only as a vision, or it's always difficult, these questions. It's like, what would hypothetically, if we found what evidence would make you think we didn't land on the moon or something like that? It's like, so I could think of things, but now when it comes to the existence of God itself, because with Christianity, we have a philosophical question and a historical question. So the question of the revelation in Christ, the falsifiability would exist in historical evidence. The question of Christian theism, the falsifiability would occur in some kind of philosophical argument, either some kind of a rebutting defeater, or an undercutting defeater to the argument. And to me, the most promising one would be something that finds some kind of logical contradiction in the description of God, or something like that, I would imagine.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks so much, guys. This has been amazing. I really appreciate both of you guys being here. So Alex said something during the discussion that suffering caused religion, or was brought about, that religion was brought about by suffering. And I guess, Trent, I just wanted to hear your response on that.
Oh, I'm glad you asked, actually, because there's always so many things that get brought up, and then we lose track of where we want to throw them out there. I mean, it's reminiscent a little bit of what Karl Marx said, religion is the opiate of the masses. But I'm not sure the thesis, suffering caused religion, that could be correlation, not causation, because human life is marked by suffering. But we have to be careful about correlation versus causation. It's like saying that cities that have more churches tend to have more crime. But it's not the churches that cause it. It's that cities that have more churches have more people, and lots of people cause crime. So I would say that religion is a natural instinct that human beings have. There's even been cognitive research showing this instinct within children. Now, some people will try to write it off as evolutionary. I think that it's equally as much evidence for an instinct that's been implanted within us to know that God exists. So I think religion is a pretty universal instinct of man's response to the divine, whatever that is. But it's a response to that transcend, whatever the Mysterium, who was, I forget. He wrote Sacred. Yeah, he wrote Sacred and Profane. Marsalia, of course.
Thanks, Josh.
Of course, Schmid knows the answer. Sacred and Profane, Mysterium et Tremendum et Fascinans.
Well, the Mysterium.
So my point is that that the suffering, that I think this could just be a part of, if it's a part of the human condition, suffering is always part of humanity. But I don't think that explains it, because many religions, it's not like people came up with religion as an explanation for suffering. Like, here is why you suffer, and God is allowing this, and God will compensate you. It seems like most religions, the answer is just, oh, there is suffering. Guess what? The gods are indifferent too. And so it's not like religion was something created to respond to suffering. Religion was something people independently turned towards and then asked, how does it fit in with suffering? And for many people, the answer is just, well, the gods are indifferent as well. I think that even in Judaism, we see a progressive as you noted, we see a progressive revelation of this, though I take issue that the Old Testament also includes, even within Job and Ecclesiastes, elements of describing God's tender care to help people through suffering. Through into Christianity, we see a more bold proclamation of suffering being something God will triumph over, that I believe is more unique to Christianity and is not just a facet of religion.
I think one of the great things about Karl Marx and his assessment of religion, and particularly that famous quote, is that a lot of that excerpt reads as if it were being spoken by a pastor in a church. He talks about religion being the sigh of the oppressed creature. He talks about it being the soul of soulless conditions, the heart of a heartless world. These are the kind of descriptions that I think many Christians would actually agree is exactly the role that God serves in their life. Whereas, as you say, there are two ways of interpreting this. You can either say, well, yeah, God is just the heart of a heartless world. That's why we know he's there, because we feel this heart. You can also interpret it to say that that's why God was invented, because we live in a heartless world and wanted some heart. Of course, Marx took the latter interpretation, but he speaks as if he's...
Sure, and I would be very careful with these lines of argument. It's very easy. They succumb to the genetic fallacy.
Of course.
Yeah. Even if it were the case that people came to believe God exists for a bad reason, it would not follow that there are no good reasons to believe in God. Just like people can come to believe in, a lot of people believe, a lot of people believe the sky is blue because it reflects the ocean. That's not true, but it doesn't reflect the fact the sky is blue and there's good reasons to believe that.
Yeah, of course. I think the reason why I mentioned this, the reason why I bring it up, is to say that everybody should be taking the problem seriously. A lot of people, it's like what Cameron was saying earlier about how a lot of theists treat the problem of evil as a triviality. They say, well, look, God is good, and sure, I don't really understand all the suffering, but I know God is good, and so there must be an explanation. They kind of brush it off, is to say, remember that this kind of discussion is embedded into the wisdom literature. This is something that the writers of the Old Testament seem to think was quite important enough to be included in the scriptural canon. And so maybe we should be taking it seriously too.
I totally agree with you that I don't think it's good for Christians to say, oh, the problem of evil is easy. That's an easy one to deal with. And then that to me, as I said in our dialogue on evil, those who have a simple answer to the problem haven't seriously considered the problem enough.
You said that you think that something like the book of Job speaks to God's tenderness.
Yes, about how God responds to evil and suffering.
Because my interpretation of the book of Job is that God responds to Job asking, and Job's lucky in the sense that when he asks for a response, for an explanation for his suffering, at least God actually answers him.
Right.
But God doesn't say, hey, take heed, I'm here for you, chill out, it's all cool, I've got a plan for you. He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel by
Gird
words
your
without
loins,
knowledge?
man.
Yeah.
Yes, but
I will question you and you will answer me, as if to say, who do you think you are to deserve an answer here? This doesn't seem very tender to me. This seems like God saying, not only am I going to inflict suffering upon you, and not only am I not going to give you an explanation as to why that suffering is taking place, but who the hell do you think you are to demand an explanation? Mm-hmm. This seems, and the tragic irony of the situation is that, of course, God is saying to Job, implying to Job, well, you can't understand your suffering. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You'll never get this. But the irony is that the reason for Job's suffering is explained to the reader of the book of Job. The author of the book of Job explains to the reader why it is that Job is suffering. He gives the story of why God is inflicting the suffering. And yet the moral of the story is supposed to be, well, Job is suffering, and he could never understand. He could never be in a position to understand. Well, we are, as a reader, it's explained to us in the book, but we're supposed to believe that Job couldn't have understood.
But what happens to Job in the end?
Anger is in the end of Job is compensated. He's given like a new wife, as if that's just going to make up for the fact that his old one died. No, again, it's this idea that you can just kind of, he's like, well, he repents in dust and ashes, and then his life is restored, and he lives, a long and happy life. What are we supposed to take from this? A man who gets has all kinds of sufferings inflicted upon him, has these moments of thinking that God isn't what he thought he was. He says, God, how could you do this? God answers him and says, who the hell do you think you are? Job goes, sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. And then he's all fine again. Where's the tenderness? Where's the compassion? Where's the kind of New Testament readying essence of Job that you were talking about?
Right. Well, there's always going to be a balance between, now God could just say, who are you? I can do whatever I want, and then leave him in the ashes. So there's a balance between God in compensating Job and giving him more than what he lost. So giving him more crops, more cattle. Though
A
interestingly,
better wife, maybe?
no, interestingly enough, the same number of children, because the Bible understands that children are not like property, that you can compensate by just giving more of something. That I always thought was an interesting note in the end of the story there, that God brings Job out of this, but at the same time, recognizing, and this is hard for us in the modern age where we have no problem speaking to the manager when we're upset about something. That was not a trait in human beings for a long time, of recognizing God's majesty and sovereignty. It's a balancing act that we can go too far and say God is so tender, he doesn't really care about having authority and being just and punishing wrongdoing. And then the other extreme is God is so sovereign, I don't care, I can stomp around because I'm the king. I do believe a right Christian theology can find a balance between the two.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would just add that I wouldn't mind if I was asking God, why is the suffering, including why you're not revealing
And it's
yourself to
important.
me. If he just screamed at me, if he just said, well, who the hell are you? I probably would be like, right, oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry, man. Like, I guess I do just repent in dust and ashes and become a Christian.
Are you sure? Really? Really?
Yeah.
Have you just heard a voice? Given your background knowledge, are you aware of many people who think they hear God, but they don't?
Yes.
How do you know you're not one of them?
Well, I wasn't even making a claim there as to what I like kind of ought to do. I'm just saying I think I would actually do that.
Okay.
I think I kind of wouldn't have a problem with that. My criticism there was just of you describing God as kind of being tender.
And also it's important when we look at like the biblical witness, the entire picture about it has to be looked at in a whole.
Yes.
So, I mean, some episodes or passages of scripture will reveal some aspects of God. For example, the Old Testament authors were extremely concerned about defending God's sovereignty, because they'll say, well, look, you think your God is so great. He lets this bad thing happen. He lets Pharaoh enslave you. And the Old Testament authors are saying, no, our God, Yahweh, he is the God of gods. He is sovereign over everything. And so they're really emphasizing that. Whereas then in maybe other aspects of the Bible, we read like in 1 Peter, we cast all our anxieties upon him. We have to look at the whole picture. But
yeah, I'm getting eyes. We need to go to the next.
Yeah, sorry.
We've got
sorry.
like what sort of 14 minutes. And
Yeah,
we
we're still
get
good,
through
we're
everyone,
good.
so we're trying to do it brief. But yes, please.
Yeah, my question's actually on that issue of compensation. So, because you gave that analogy with the bar, people tearing it apart. My question is, does it matter that on the Christian view, the compensation is not merely in sort of these finite temporal goods, like, well, my house got taken out by a tornado and God's going to give me 2 in heaven or something like that, but that in heaven we come into a relationship not with some finite goods, but with the good itself? Doesn't that kind of put it maybe in a different category of things we're talking about? Is that relevant to this notion of repayment? Is my question.
I certainly think that makes a difference. I think another response to the analogy that I gave there might be something like saying that for the bar owner or the restaurant owner, sure, their bar's smashed up without asking them first, but I think that if you were even to ask them, would you want this? If you were given the opportunity to have some boys come in and smash up your bar and then give you a bunch of money, they might say no. They'd feel too disrespected by that, and maybe that's part of the problem. Whereas, of course, God might inflict suffering upon me and compensate me in the afterlife. But if you ask me, well, if you did kind of know that was what was going to happen, would you be okay with being put through that? I might actually say yes in a way the restaurant owner might say no. But then the restaurant owner might still say yes, and it still seems a bit grosque to.
I don't know. Like if
that.
somebody said to me, "We're going to burn down your house, but we'll give you $10 million," I'd say, "Here you go. Here's the matches. Off you." No, seriously. I think the compensation really does.
Yeah.
Now it depends on the kind of evil. If someone says, "I'll give you $10 million," there's that movie, An Indecent Proposal. I'll give you $10 million to sleep with your wife. I'm like, well, hold on a minute there, good sir. And I think my wife, hopefully, obviously, she would have, object to that. But so it would be so I agree with you about compensation, that it may not explain something. So if God were to directly commit intrinsically evil things that can never be justified, my view would be difficult. But if it's merely I'm allowing the natural consequences of humans with free will, animals in a world with entropy and pain, if it's allowing these things to happen, then yeah, like I would totally be okay with all of the awful things that come with my home, with even, with just my property damage, and I get $10 million afterwards. To me, then, if heaven is that huge compensation, it changes the math a lot.
So, surprise, Alex, my question's for you. And I appreciate your patience because I feel like I've been harassing you all day. So, so I've been trying to, I guess, understand kind of where you're coming from, just like your framework of thought. And as far as whenever I'm putting it together, we have the emotivism that you kind of advocated for in this discussion. You and I talked briefly about the determinism. And I know elsewhere that mereological nihilism is kind of on you. So I guess I would really love to hear how you assess probability and evidence, because how our frameworks are going to impact how we interpret evidence and probability. And it doesn't seem like you're too much of a fan either of probability either, because you took issue with like modified versions of the PSR because it's not going to give you an exhaustive explanation. But of course, modest explanations do explain to a degree. So I guess if you could kind of lay out for me where you're coming from on how you assess probability or evidence more generally, that way I can, because I feel like your framework may affect that, and I'm just trying to understand better.
I wonder what you mean by assessing probabilities. I mean, I think that most instances in which we're dealing with probabilities, we're actually just dealing with ignorance. We're talking about an epistemic probability here. Like it's just for want of information that we ascribe probabilities to things. But metaphysically speaking, the thing has a 100% chance of happening the way that it does. The only time we ascribe probability to flipping a coin or rolling a dice or something is when we know too little to be able to accurately predict. So probabilities are kind of an epistemic problem here. But I wonder what you mean by that.
Could I clarify?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm more along the lines getting at is like, okay, so let's say, like, I know you don't take the contingency argument to be sound.
What? Fine tune?
No,
contingency.
Oh, contingency.
With the PSR.
So like, whenever you hear these arguments, is it more along the lines of this argument doesn't work, moving on? Or is there when you assess all of the, because you've done a lot of reading over the past couple of years, you've been listening to the arguments, you've been interacting, where all of us at some level are going to put this information in different places, either for or against a given proposition. And that's kind of more what I'm getting at is like when you hear that data, where are you putting it, and how do you feel like enough of it could overcome your skepticism, or is your skepticism more of a like position that you hold until it's overturned in a more like robust, exhaustive sense?
There are certain arguments which I think flatly just kind of don't work. For example, if somebody puts forward a principle of sufficient reason, and I put forward this wasn't in this discussion, it was in an earlier discussion, but I was talking about the modal fatalism objection. It's the kind of objection which, to me, just undermines it entirely. So if you have the principle of sufficient reason that's not modified in the ways we were talking about earlier, and I have this reason to think that it just doesn't work, it's basically self-defeating, then for me, that like my kind of assessment of that in terms of the probability of God existing, it just doesn't affect it, because I think the argument just doesn't work. There are other arguments that I think do increase the credence of Christianity, but there are two types of successful inductive arguments here. One is an argument that makes the conclusion more probably true than false. And another version of success is where the conclusion is made more probably true than it was before you heard the argument. So some people think that for an argument to be successful, it has to, give you like 60% probability of God's existence or something like this. But it could just be that you think that there's like a 1% chance that God exists, and then you hear an argument that bumps it up to 2. That's still a successful argument in a different sense, but you're still left with like a 98% probability that God doesn't exist or something. As I said earlier, I find it very difficult to put a number on credence of belief. I don't really know how to ascribe probability to like the truth of propositions in terms of beliefs. But there are certainly arguments that I think increase the credence of Christianity, and arguments that I think diminish it. I don't know how to answer your question specifically. I mean, for instance, I think like the resurrection accounts in the Gospels increase the probability of Christianity being true. I don't think they increase it very much. I don't think they increase it enough to make me think that Christianity is probably true, but I think it's more probably true than if we didn't have those accounts, probably significantly more probably true. Well done. Significantly more probably true, but to try and put like a number on that or something, I just think is an impossible
Well,
task.
do you think in principle it could overturn your atheism to theism?
I think it could
think
do as part of a cumulative case, right? There might be one argument that I hear, like if the modal ontological argument is sound, if we get like a successful symmetry breaker, then I just become a theist, just like that, right? Like at least I probably kind of rationally would be compelled to. Wouldn't be a Christian, but like if there's just an inescapable conclusion, then sure.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of doubtful that there is an argument that will have that individual power. I think it's more likely that we'll keep adding to a cumulative case and increasing the credence. And eventually, yeah, that could outweigh, because really the strong atheism of there is no God basically just has the problem of evil. It has divine hiddenness. That's kind of a subset of the problem of evil. It has like, another argument I gave in a recent debate was the geographical distribution of religious belief. That's kind of just a subset of divine hiddenness. You've basically just got this one argument. And so in theory, at least, as long as you keep discovering new arguments to the existence of God, if they keep adding cumulatively to the probability of God's existence, that could one day sort of override it.
Gotcha.
So maybe if I just keep reading again and again and again, then finally I might be nudged in that direction. I guess it just hasn't happened yet.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks. I actually have a really interesting question that I want to ask you,
Okay.
Trent, but I want to make sure we get to the end of the discussion, just basically on that and the idea of getting there eventually one day.
All right.
But I want to make sure we get to the questions.
Thank you. So this is in relation to the discussion you had about divine hiddenness. This is more for Alex, but I'm curious if Trent has any thoughts. So one of the ideas I've been toying with when thinking about divine hiddenness is, because we think about it like parents, and I think about the skeptic, honest skeptic who maybe never finds God in this life, along with maybe the Christian who has doubts their entire life. They are the children that the parent knows they can trust more. It's like, there are others that I baby. There are the ones that, they never have doubts. Lucky them, as Alex puts it. But these are the ones that God knows he can trust more, because I find that the Christians who have the doubts all their lives, the atheists who honestly are seeking God and never find him, they are some of the most inquisitive, philosophically responsible, moral people. Such as yourself, you take your veganism very seriously as a product of this philosophical reflection that I'm not sure maybe began because you were thinking about God's existence. I'm not sure what you think of that idea, that these are the children that God knows he can trust, because they are going to be far more morally developed through that process of hiddenness.
Well, if these are the kind of people that God can trust to, say, eventually come to know him, then I guess I can just say that in my experience that, of course, hasn't happened. Maybe
Yes.
it will happen one day. I'm not sure, but at least for now, it just hasn't happened. Also, I understand like a parent who might sort of say, well, I'm going to look after these kids carefully because I know that the other kids, they're old enough to look after themselves, so I'll let them go and play in the street. I don't need to give them my attention. The reason why a parent might have reason to do that is because they have limited resources. They have limited time that they can attribute to each child. But of course, God's not in that position. Maybe he can trust people who like to do philosophy to eventually kind of come to truth or something. But it's obviously not working for a lot of people. A lot of people are doing philosophy. A lot of people are doing it very cleverly and not coming to God. So if he trusts that they'll eventually sort of come to the truth and come to a relationship with him, his trust has been misplaced, it seems. And so it seems weird to say that God leaves certain people to sort of do it for themselves without his constant presence, because he just trusts that they'll get there anyway, which would imply that if there's at least one example of somebody who is such a person and doesn't come to know him, he's misplaced his trust and he's done something wrong. He's therefore sort of impotent or not all knowledgeable, which would not be compatible with the idea of God. So I'm not really sure what I think about it, but I quite like it as a consolation. The idea that, like, look, the reason why God is distant from you is because he knows that you've got this, like you're on the right track here, like you'll get there eventually. I can understand why that's quite consoling. My problem, and it's kind of like the problem I was going to ask Trent, but I'll just put it as a point, is if you believe in human free will. Seems like a bit of an odd term, but if you have somebody who is in a situation where, let's say that today I'm an atheist, but next week I'm going to become a Christian, and we might say that like, there's some kind of brilliance in this journey of discovery, and maybe the reason it hasn't been revealed to me now is because there's something about this journey to becoming a Christian next week. Jesus says that the prodigal son returning is more celebratory than someone who never went astray. The same with the sheep and the coin. There's something good about coming back. if there's human free will, then of course, like, Trent, there's nothing stopping Trent in principle from standing up and killing me right now. He could just strangle me in front of a crowd or something. And that would mean I would die.
I have been taking Muay Thai for 3 weeks, so just saying.
I'm sure he's probably been tempted to at a few points during this conversation. Of course, that would mean that I would die a non-believer. And yet, if I were allowed to live for another week, and then I died after that, I would die a believer. And basically, Trent seems to have within his hands the ability to decide whether I'm saved or not, at least under some interpretations. You could be like a Molinist or something, but Trent seems to have this power to decide whether I die as a believer or an unbeliever. As long as you've got human free will in the picture there, then if you want to say that, yeah, like God just trusts that certain people will do a bunch of philosophical investigation and one day they might come to him, it's like, well, hopefully somebody doesn't use their free will to cut their life short before they get there. Because if they do, then it seems that the reason why I die not saved is not because of my failure or because of God's failure or something like this, but surely just purely because some random person has decided to kill me. This seems to me an intolerable conclusion. So I think I don't think this line of thought would work for numerous reasons.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, my question, can you hear me? All right. My question relates to how an atheist who rejects moral objectivism could see our world suffering as a reason to be an atheist. Such an atheist could have a standard of goodness such that if a loving God adopted this standard, God would not permit the suffering we see. A theist could think that while God is perfectly loving and thus values our immediate well-being because he is perfectly loving, God adopts other values that supersede valuing our immediate well-being, such that if God adopted this theist standard of goodness, God would permit all the suffering we see. Without an objective moral standard of goodness, there doesn't seem to be any objective fact of the matter which standard of goodness God would adopt if he existed. So how would you respond to this argument for the atheist who rejects moral objectivism? The existence of the suffering and evil is not a reason to be an atheist because without an objective moral standard, the atheist isn't in a position to know whether God would permit this suffering.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's a fine question. The idea, and I'll make sure that I'm understanding you properly, I think the idea is something like, yes, I can kind of try and make this internal critique of Christianity and say, well, if there were this objective morality, it wouldn't contain these kinds of things. Who might say that? I mean, I'm the one who doesn't believe in objective morality. Surely an objective morality that has some difficult aspects that are quite hard to swallow is better than no objective morality at all. Again, I'd like to slightly reframe how I'm putting forward this criticism. I'm not saying that if there is an objective morality, there's just no way that it could possibly allow for animals to be dying in the wild or something like this. That's not quite what I'm saying. What I'm rather saying is that if there is such a justification, I'm curious to see what people think that it is. It does seem to me unjustifiable, but you're right that I can't really say that it's unjustifiable without already kind of begging the question, presupposing some standard by which I'm criticizing it, right? What I'm really saying is just, if you think that this suffering is justified, if that's a view that you've committed yourself to, I want to know if either you think you can tell me what that justification is, or you could say, well, I can't say what the justification is, but I'm confident that there is a justification. You can just be a skeptical theist. You can say, yeah, like I just know that God exists, so I know there is a justification, even if I can't tell you what that is. I just like to see what approach people are taking, because Trent offered some suggestions of things that seem, maybe this kind of thing would justify the suffering that humans are going through or animals are going through. And I can tell you why I'm unconvinced by those. I can tell you why those aren't enough to make me think, Christianity's actually maybe got more going for it than I thought that it did. But if Trent were to say something like, well, look, I can't tell you why this suffering is justified. What I can tell you is that I have a separate body of arguments that say that God exists, and then I have the entailment that therefore all the suffering is justified because God is good. I don't know what the justification is, but I know that it is justified because of this separate body of arguments. Then I would have to say something like, I mean, there are obviously things I would say to that, but I'd be happy to say something like, fair enough. Okay, let's talk about the arguments for the existence of God then. So you're right. It's difficult for me to levy a claim that something like, well, there's no objective morality, but if there were, it wouldn't contain this, because I have to appeal to a standard even to say that. But I don't think that's quite the nature of the claim that I'm making or the question that I'm asking. But maybe you think that is what I'm doing. Maybe you think I'm just kind of doing that, but trying to dress it up in a more modest clothing, being a kind of a lion in sheep's clothing.
Well, I think with the problem of evil, I've tried to make clear that my reply to it is that There are cases where I think people agree God is justified in allowing evil. And so from that, I do not see, given the background knowledge of God's omnipotence and omniscience, why he would not have other reasons. And I can project outward, not what the exact reasons are, but an approximation. And for many of them, especially with animal suffering, for me, it would be even things like the intrinsic goodness of the existence of animals themselves. Similar to the previous debate that we've had, I can come up with lots of thought experiments that if it isn't wrong for us to, there's a certain goodness in allowing animals and creatures to exist. That's not wrong for us to maybe start an evolutionary process on another planet, or we wouldn't just destroy creatures to prevent them from suffering. That there's just an intrinsic goodness in it existing. But did you say you had a question to ask me?
I was going to ask you about the free will thing and whatnot, but I think.
Okay.
I'm getting.
No, wait.
I'm
Does
getting,
this?
I'm
He
getting,
did this.
I'm
Does this
getting
mean
this.
you're good to shut up?
I'm getting this.
It was very ambiguous.
It's like, yeah.
The problem
shut
is,
up.
Cameron's revelation was unfortunately ambiguous and subject to misinterpretation from his followers. He gave a thumbs up and then this. But no, this has been good, and yeah, hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes, thank you all for sitting and listening for 2 hours, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite an investment, so thanks.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?